The rain hadn't stopped in 2 days. It was the kind of persistent, steady rainfall that soaked through stone, that blanketed the sky in grey so thick it stole the colour from the world. The hills of Tuscany, once green and lush, looked almost sombre under the weight of water and silence. From the narrow road leading into the village, a single black car rolled toward the gates of the convent. It moved like a shadow come to life, low and gleaming, its windows tinted as dark as obsidian. It was not the kind of vehicle that belonged in this place, simple, rural, humble, and yet it was expected, feared, accepted. Inside the stone walls of the convent, a young woman stood at a window, hands clasped tightly in front of her. Her fingers trembled, though she tried to hide it. Her breath fogged the glass as she leaned forward, her eyes fixed on the approaching car. She had been told this moment would come, not in words, never directly, but in the way the nuns lowered their gazes when she passed, in the way the prayers at night grew longer, more desperate. She had heard the name whispered behind doors and in the quiet corridors of the chapel Moretti. It was a name that echoed like thunder in hushed voices. Not a man, but a force. Not a visitor, but a verdict. Her name was Isabella D'Angelo, 19 years old. Raised within the cold embrace of the church, her life had been one of stillness and obedience. She had learned to sew, to cook, to recite prayers in Latin, to walk with eyes lowered and voice restrained. Her world was built on silence and submission. She had never kissed a man, had never wanted to. Until now, the world outside the convent walls had been a blur, a vague idea. But the moment that car turned onto the gravel path, reality became sharper, crueler, heavier. Her heart pounded so loudly she feared the other sisters could hear it. The car stopped at the main doors. The nuns waited at the entrance, their habits clinging to damp skin, their faces expressionless, and then he stepped out. Luca Moretti. He didn't rush. His movements were deliberate, slow, precise. He wore a black wool coat that cut sharply against his broad frame, and his shoes made no sound on the wet stone. His presence spread like smoke, filling the air, thickening it. The nuns parted as he passed, heads bowed. Isabella didn't see his face clearly at first. She saw only posture, power, and the glint of something dangerous in the set of his shoulders. He had come for her. The door to her room opened, and the Mother Superior entered with a sadness that didn't reach her voice. She gestured for Isabella to follow. No explanation. None was needed. With numb hands, Isabella wrapped a shawl over her shoulders and stepped into the hallway. She walked like someone going to confession, slowly, reverently, afraid of the weight of her own breath. At the main hall, he was waiting. She looked at him, then truly looked, and her stomach twisted. He was handsome, undeniably, but it was a severe kind of beauty, a face carved from cold marble, with eyes like polished steel. Not youthful, not gentle, powerful, terrifying. He didn't smile. He didn't offer his hand. He simply nodded once and turned. She followed him out of the only home she had ever known. The car ride was silent. The interior of the vehicle was dark leather and chrome, to clean, to sterile. She sat with her hands in her lap, eyes on her knees. She could feel his gaze without looking. He studied her like a collector studies a relic, measuring, assessing, already planning her place on his shelf. The city lights were distant. They passed through hills, olive groves, stone villages asleep under the rain. Eventually, the car turned through wrought iron gates and followed. A private drive that wound up a hill to a house that looked more like a fortress than a home. Stone walls, tall windows, Roman statues standing like silent sentinels in the gardens. The house rose from the ground as if it had always been there, heavy with history and secrets. Inside, warmth didn't greet her. The mansion was grand, ornate, filled with art and silence. Everything smelled of leather, cedar, and something more masculine, cologne, perhaps, or power. A maid took her coat, avoiding her eyes. Another led her down a hallway lined with dark oil paintings and tall mirrors. She was brought to a bedroom. It was twice the size of the chapel back home. The bed was carved from oak, dressed in deep red sheets. Velvet curtains framed tall windows that looked out into the darkness. A fireplace glowed softly in one corner, but the warmth didn't reach her. The maid left. The door closed, and Isabella stood alone in the center of a world that was no longer hers. Her suitcase, small, modest, containing nothing of value, had already been placed by the wardrobe. She didn't touch it. Instead, she sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the fire. Hours passed, or minutes. Time was a haze. Upstairs, Luca Moretti poured himself a drink. He watched her on the monitor, one of many. The house was filled with cameras, with eyes, not out of paranoia but because control required observation. She didn't know she was being watched. That was part of the design. He had expected fear. What he saw was something else. Stillness. She didn't cry, didn't tremble. She sat with her back straight, her hands clasped. A girl raised in silence, trained in obedience. But even from a screen, he could see the flicker in her eyes. Not defiance but depth. He had acquired many things in his life. Paintings, properties, blood debts. But this girl was different. He did not touch her that night, nor the next. She was not to be broken quickly. That was not his way. Instead, he watched, and Isabella waited. She ate in silence. She dressed in the clothes that appeared in her wardrobe each morning, soft fabrics, elegant, never revealing, always deliberate. She walked the halls like a ghost, her footsteps lost in the rugs. She read books from the Library of Philosophy, poetry, old texts in Italian and Latin. She never asked questions. She didn't need to. She knew what she was, a debt repaid in flesh, a possession passed from father to creditor. She didn't rage against it. There was no point. Her power, if she had any, would not be found in resistance. And yet, something stirred inside her, a pulse. She began to sense his presence even when he wasn't in the room. She noticed the scent of his cologne lingering in the library, the sound of his footsteps in the hallway, always on. She saw glimpses of him through windows, across gardens, at the top of staircases. He never spoke to her, never acknowledged her directly. And still, she felt the air tighten when he was near, as if her lungs forgot how to breathe. She didn't know what he wanted. Not really. He had her body, but he hadn't touched it. He had her presence, but he hadn't demanded anything. It was worse than cruelty. It was patience. She learned things from servants who didn't speak but couldn't hide their fear, from books filled with more redactions than words, from paintings on the walls of men with eyes like his. She learned that the Moretti family had ruled not only businesses, but bloodlines, that Florence owed them quiet debts and whispered favors, that enemies disappeared, and those who asked too many questions didn't ask twice. And yet, she did not fear him the way she should. She began to wonder what had made him the way he was. No one was born like that. No child dreams of growing into coldness. Something had burned him once, perhaps more than once. One evening, while walking through the east wing, she found a door slightly ajar. It led into a study. She had never seen this room before. Inside, the walls were lined with shelves, old books and files. On a side table, a single framed photograph stood alone. A woman beautiful, with dark eyes and a faint smile. There was tenderness in the photo that didn't belong in this house. Isabella didn't recognize her, but she recognized the man beside her. Younger, yes, but unmistakably Luca Moretti. And in his eyes, something that no longer existed. She left the study quietly. That night, she dreamed of him, not as a monster, but as a man whose past still bled under his skin. And in the dream, he touched her, not violently, not cruelly, but with the aching hunger of someone who hadn't tasted softness in years. She woke with the feeling of his breath on her skin, though he hadn't touched her. Her pulse thundered, her cheeks burned, shame curled in her stomach like smoke. She tried to pray, but the words wouldn't come. The rain eventually stopped, but the clouds did not lift. The days in the Moretti estate blurred into one another, stitched together by silence, routine, and that ever-present tension hanging in the air like the final note of a symphony that refused to end. Isabella's world had changed, but his boundaries were still invisible. No one told her where she could or couldn't go, but she knew. There were no locked doors, only thresholds thick with warning. She crossed none of them, except one, the study. After finding the photograph of the woman beside a younger, gentler Luca, she returned to that room night after night, always careful, always silent. She never touched the frame again, but she looked at it, memorized it. The woman's eyes held something that haunted her softness perhaps, or the echo of something lost forever. She began to piece together fragments, clippings, documents, hints tucked between pages of old ledgers. The woman had been his wife, once, taken, murdered, no suspects, no convictions. But Isabella knew the truth, not in the legal sense, but in the way a soul recognizes another's wound. That loss had hollowed him out, had filled him with something else. She was not naive enough to think she could fix that, but she was no longer able to ignore how that truth bound them, because she, too, was hollow. For different reasons. Her life had been all walls and candles and rules. She had known no great loss, no pain carved by violence, but she had never been chosen, never seen, never wanted, until now. The hunger began quietly. She noticed it first in the way she became aware of his presence. Before he entered a room, her skin would prickle, her stomach would tighten. He didn't look at her often, but when he did, it was with the stillness of a man memorizing something sacred. He continued to keep his distance, like a shadow circling the flame. She was watched. She knew that, but there was no violation, no cruelty in his gaze-only possession, as though he was waiting for the moment when the claiming would be not a theft, but an offering. She tried to resist the thoughts. At night, in her room, she would undress slowly, careful not to look at her reflection in the mirror. She would lie in bed, arms at her sides, eyes fixed on the ceiling, but still, she could feel him. The weight of him, the warmth of a body that had never touched hers but already knew her. She dreamt vivid dreams that left her breathless, dreams where he held her wrists, pressed his mouth to her throat, pulled her hair back with a reverence that felt like prayer. There was no violence in those dreams, but there was no gentleness either, just inevitability. Like a storm finally breaking, she woke, flushed, her nightgown damp at the collar. She stopped praying. Instead, she walked. Each night, barefoot and ghost-like, she wandered the halls of the Moretti estate. The house had become her cage, her church, and her confession. The art on the walls watched her. The floor creaked under her weight, but no one stopped her. The guards, the maids, they averted their eyes. Everyone knew who she was, or rather, what she was to him. She found comfort in the marble corridors, in the solitude. Sometimes she would sit by the indoor fountain, watching the ripples under the moonlight through the glass ceiling. Sometimes she would find one of his books left open, his wineglass still warm. His absence was louder than his presence. One night, everything shifted. She had wandered farther than usual, the eastern wing, near the main library. She had just stepped into a side hallway when she saw him. He was standing near one of the tall windows, his back to her shirt unbuttoned at the collar, sleeves rolled up. The moonlight traced the lines of his shoulders, the muscles in his forearms. In one hand, a glass. In the other, a letter he didn't seem to be reading. He didn't move. And yet, she felt him feel her. Her breath caught, her feet frozen against the floor. The silence between them stretched and crackled like static in the air. He didn't turn, but she didn't leave. They stood like that, separated by a dozen steps, and something deeper 4 minutes that felt like hours. And in that moment, something passed between them. Not words, not touch. Something older, more ancient. A surrender that hadn't happened yet, but was no longer deniable. She returned to her room shaken, not because of fear, because she wanted more. The next day, everything she touched seemed altered. The feel of silk against her skin, the taste of strawberries on her tongue, the smell of cedar in the hallways. The world had grown sharper, brighter, more sensual. He had not touched her, but his absence pressed against her like a hand at the back of her neck. She began to watch him, too, when he passed by her in the gardens, when he spoke briefly with his men, when he sat at the long oak table during dinner, never looking at her, never speaking. He was the storm she was stepping into willingly. Barefoot, she started wearing dresses with softer fabrics, let her hair down, not for vanity, but for him. She caught glimpses of herself in mirrors still pale, still quiet, but different. Lescat, more woman, and still untouched. He allowed her into his world in pieces, a seat left for her at his private table, access to parts of the library once forbidden, the occasional notebook he'd marked for her, a poem underlined, a passage highlighted in Latin. What the soul desires, it seeks in silence. And she did desire. It crept in her blood like heat, like fire under her skin. The turning point came in the form of a storm. Not rain this time, but wind. The power flickered. The house groaned. Outside, trees swayed violently, branches scraping the windows like fingers. She couldn't sleep. The candles in her room had gone out. The air was heavy, restless, and she found herself walking again. This time, not aimlessly. She went to the study. The door was ajar, as always, but this time he was inside, seated by the fireplace, the flames casting long shadows across his face. He didn't look surprised to see her. He didn't speak. Neither did she. She stepped inside. Her pulse thundered so loud she thought it would deafen her. The fire danced in the reflection of his eyes. He remained seated, one hand resting on the armrest, the other on his knee, still as stone. But his stillness was a command. She stepped closer. Each movement was a choice, each breath a surrender. She stood before him, and the silence was no longer avoided, it was full of expectation. He looked at her then, truly looked, and the hunger she had felt blooming inside her for weeks was nothing compared to the abyss she saw in his gaze. He had waited, he would keep waiting, but she was the one who leaned forward first, not to kiss him, not to beg, but to offer her presence fully. And in that unspoken offering, the balance shifted. He reached out, not to touch her skin but to take her wrist, gently, firmly, and place it against his heart. She felt the beat, slow, measured, dangerous, and then he let go. She left the room with her heart echoing the rhythm of his. That night, she lay in bed with her hand pressed to her chest, trying to remember the exact weight of his pulse, not because she wanted to memorize it, because she already had. The hunger was no longer quiet, it was roaring. The morning came slow and silver, sliding through the tall windows in muted streaks. The storm had passed, but the air still carried its aftertaste, charged like a secret not yet spoken. Isabella did not rise at once. Her body felt heavier, not from sleep but from something else. A current still clung to her skin, one she had carried from the study the night before. Her wrist, where his hand had held her, burned faintly with memory. She had touched the heart of a monster, and it had not been cold. She moved through the house differently that day. Her steps were not lighter, but more certain. The silence no longer intimidated her. It belonged to her now. Every corridor, every marble column and arched ceiling seemed to echo with her presence. The servants noticed. Their glances lingered longer, filled with new caution. Not fear of her, but of what she now was. Something changed. She had not become mistress of the house, but she had become its center. She felt it, and he had let it happen. She saw him once that day outside, in the garden. He stood near the stone balustrade, speaking to one of his men, the wind tugging at his coat. Even from a distance, she felt him. His presence was gravity. He did not look at her, yet her pulse responded to him like it always did, without permission. She watched his hand as he gestured a hand that had held hers without possession, without pressure, a command wrapped in calm, a storm held by restraint. That night, she stood before her mirror longer than usual. Her hair, no longer kept in braids or modest buns, fell over her shoulders like a veil. Her nightgown clung to her skin with the faintest tremble of transparency. She traced the collarbone visible through the fabric, and for the first time did not look away from her own reflection. She had been kept untouched by fate, protected, caged, prized, but now, untouched, no longer meant safe. It meant waiting, and she was tired of waiting. It was not rebellion that guided her steps that night. It was something quieter, something that had grown from within, watered by silence and watched by his eyes from the dark. She knew where he would be. The eastern wing had always been his retreat. She walked barefoot through the hallways, the cold of the stone floor grounding her, reminding her she was awake, alive. The corridor to his quarters was dimly lit, and the air grew warmer as she neared. The scent of cedar, smoke, and something darker filled her lungs. His door was open. Inside, the fire burned low. The room smelled of old leather and solitude. He stood by the hearth, one hand resting against the mantel, the other curled loosely at his side. He had known she would come. She stepped inside. The door closed behind her without a sound. He didn't move, neither did she. They stood in the silence, and something shifted, not suddenly, not like lightning, but like the slow movement of tectonic plates beneath the earth. The kind of shift that causes mountains to rise and oceans to drown. When she crossed the room to him, her movements were steady, her breath even, but inside her, something ancient stirred, something that didn't belong to the girl who had been left at a convent gate, or to the woman who had been bought with blood debt. This was hers, and hers alone. She reached out and touched his back. He did not flinch. Her fingers slid over the fabric of his shirt, down to his side, resting there. She felt the tension in him muscle tight beneath skin, restraint honed over years. She moved closer. His breathing deepened. She felt it through her palm. He let her come to him, always patient, always still. But it wasn't indifference. It was storm held at bay, He was letting her choose, letting her cross the threshold, and she did. Her other hand rose, fingertips grazing the line of his spine, then his shoulder, then his jaw. When he finally turned to face her, she was not surprised by what she saw in his eyes. Not hers. His he had built himself into stone, forged by fire and ash and blood. But she had walked into his house with bare feet in silence, and now she stood before him as the only threat he could not extinguish. Her hands rose to his collar. She undid the first button, then the second. Her fingers trembled, but not with fear. When he took her wrists and stilled them, she expected rejection. But he did not push her away. He only looked at her, and something unspoken passed between them, a promise made without words, a warning without cruelty. This was not a fairy tale. There would be no gentleness in what would come, only truth, only fire. She nodded, and he released her. Her nightgown fell from her shoulders like mist, pooling at her feet. She stood before him as she was uncovered, vulnerable, unashamed. He looked at her as though he'd been starving for centuries, and when he finally reached for her, it was not hunger alone. It was reverence, like a man touching something he feared he might destroy simply by holding. His hands were rough from violence, but they moved over her with a precision that made her gasp, not from pain, but from the unbearable weight of being seen. Not as a girl, not as a debt, as a woman. The first touch was not on her skin, but within her soul. It unraveled her slowly, completely. He took nothing she did not give, but what she gave fully. He carried her to his bed like she was made of consequence. She had imagined it differently. She had thought there would be shame, awkwardness, fear, but there was only surrender. His mouth marked her throat, her breasts, her stomach, not with cruelty, but with intention. He moved slowly, as if memorizing the shape of her ribs, the curve of her hips, the pulse in her wrists. Every breath was answered with his, every tremble met with stillness. And when he finally entered her, it was not the end of something, it was the breaking of a spell. Pain came first, sharp, bright, a shattering, but she did not resist. She held his gaze, and in it saw herself. He did not speak, but she heard him through every movement, every breath, every pause. He told her what his voice never could, that she was no longer just his possession. She was his undoing. They moved together, not like lovers, but like absolution. Each motion a confession, each sound an answer. The room filled with the scent of heat, the sound of skin, the rush of breath. She cried out, once not in fear, but in release, and then he stilled. They lay in silence. No words, no apologies. She traced the scar on his chest with a fingertip. He closed his eyes, and for the first time since she arrived, he looked like a man without armor. The firelight flickered. Shadows danced on the ceiling, and in that bed, surrounded by centuries of stone, Isabella realized she was no longer waiting. She had arrived. The dawn after did not break with light. It unfolded with weight. Isabella opened her eyes to the slow, silver gray of morning seeping between velvet curtains. The room, though unchanged in appearance, no longer felt foreign. It had become the stage of her unmaking and, in ways she did not yet understand, her rebirth. The sheets still held the warmth of him. The scent of cedar, smoke, and something darker lingered in the fabric. Her body ached not in pain, but in memory. Every inch of her skin bore the quiet imprint of his hands, of his mouth, of the way he had not rushed, the way he had broken her slowly, as if destruction were a ceremony. She remained still for a long time, watching the shadows move across the ceiling. The world beyond the room felt distant, muted. It no longer held her. Something inside her had shifted. She was not the girl who had stepped into that mansion with lowered eyes and trembling fingers. She was no longer a name on a ledger, a payment made in blood and silence. She had become something else. Not just his, herself, but in becoming, there was loss. She felt it like a low hum beneath her ribs. The surrender of innocence, the acceptance of danger, the terrifying clarity that she had chosen this man, this house, this life of whispered power and shadowed walls. She did not regret it, but she knew what it would cost. He had left her before the sun rose. No words, no trace of emotion, only the echo of his body beside hers, and the heavy space where his presence had been. It should have felt like abandonment. Instead, it felt like ritual, like he had given her time to breathe before the next storm. She dressed slowly that morning. Her gown was a deep, soft, gray, almost silver in the changing light. Her hair fell in soft waves down her back. She wore no makeup, no jewelry. She didn't need to be adorned. The room had already crowned her with something intangible. When she stepped into the hallway, the house breathed differently. The staff looked at her not with curiosity, but with certainty. They knew, not through gossip or observation, through instinct. Something in her posture, her expression, her silence had marked the shift. She had crossed the threshold most never even saw. She was no longer untouchable. She had been touched, but not owned. There was power in that distinction. She spent the morning in the garden, walking beneath the olive trees, letting her fingertips graze the leaves, the stones, the breath of the wind. Nature seemed distant here, restrained by design, but the sky clouded and moody understood her. By afternoon, she returned to the east wing, drawn back by the gravity of him. She did not seek him directly. She did not need to. Every corner of the house whispered his presence. His world was stitched into the wallpaper, the scent of ink on letters, the click of boots on marble. She paused in the study. The fireplace was cold, the photographs still untouched. The woman in the frame no longer felt like a warning. She felt like a prologue. Isabella met her gaze and offered nothing but quiet understanding. That evening, she was summoned, not with words nor instructions, simply by the timing of dinner, the setting of a place beside him at the long table where power had always dined in silence. He sat at the head, back straight, suit immaculate, expression unreadable. She took her seat without hesitation. No conversation passed. None was needed. There was no affection in his movements, no softness in his glance, as if he looked at all. But she felt him, the way he noticed, the way she held her fork, the way her fingers curled over the rim of the glass, the way she breathed. He saw everything and chose not to show it. Control remained his language, and still, she knew, beneath the suit, beneath the stillness, he was unraveling, not quickly, not loudly, but inevitably. That night, he did not come to her, and she did not seek him. Their silence was not distance, it was tension. It built in the days that followed. He resumed his routines, meetings behind closed doors, coded conversations with men who carried death in their pockets, phone calls in languages that bruised the air. His world pulsed with secrets and danger. But now, she was in it. He let her linger nearby when once she would have been kept far away. She learned names, patterns. She listened more than she spoke, watched more than she moved. He never explained anything, but she was not stupid. She saw the shape of the empire beneath the elegance. It was not just crime, it was control, and now she was part of it. He did not parade her. He did not cage her. He simply let her remain, and in that quiet inclusion, she began to understand how intimacy looked in a world like his, not in touches or confessions, but in trust. He trusted her presence, trusted her silence, trusted her to walk through the hallways where men disappeared and wars were born, and she trusted him not to break her. But something else began to creep in, not between them but around them. The staff whispered less. The guards grew more vigilant. Windows that had once remained open were now shuttered. Schedules shifted. She felt it like a tremor beneath the marble floor. Danger, not from within but from beyond. It came in fragments. A missing associate, a delayed shipment, a rival name scrawled in red ink. Luca never spoke of it, never faltered, but she saw the tightness in his jaw, the heaviness in his gaze when he thought she wasn't looking. She wondered if it was guilt for letting her in, because now she was not just in his world. She was a vulnerability, and vulnerabilities bled. One night, she woke to the sound of distant voices, low, sharp, urgent. She rose without dressing fully, wrapping herself in a silk robe, and followed the sound like a ghost. The doors to his office were open. He stood in the center, surrounded by men whose faces bore the tension of men too accustomed to death to be easily shaken. And yet, they were shaken. Papers on the desk, maps, names, circles drawn in red. She did not step inside, but he saw her. For the first time, she saw it, not behind his eyes but within them. Fear, not for himself, for her. He dismissed the men with a gesture, and then they were alone. He did not move toward her, and she did not reach for him, but the space between them pulsed with something darker than hunger, more dangerous than desire. Attachment. He had let her in, and now he would have to protect her, not as property, but as something far worse, something he could lose. She returned to her room that night without his touch, but she no longer needed it to feel his hold. It was for his room, no longer a symbol of seduction, but of shelter. The fall had begun, and neither of them would stop it. It began with silence, not the familiar, velvet stillness of the Moretti estate, but a wrong kind of quiet, a void, the kind of silence that settles before the world remembers how to scream. Isabella noticed it first in the way the birds vanished from the garden, in how the guards at the gate began to carry rifles instead of pistols, in the faint tremble beneath the floorboards each time Luca's voice rose behind closed doors. Something had shifted, and it was coming closer. She had not seen him in 2 days. Not truly. He moved through the house like smoke present, but untouchable, always flanked by men, always speaking in sharp, clipped commands. He looked the same, dressed the same, but his gaze had grown darker, deeper, like a storm forming behind glass. She knew something was coming, and she knew it would come for her. It happened on the third night. The sky had turned red, burning low behind the hills like a wound in the clouds. Isabella stood at the window in Luca's room, her robe cinched loosely, her hair undone. She felt the air stiffen, the temperature drop. The wind whispered like a warning through the glass panes. And then came the sound. Not loud at first, just a thud. Then another. Then the unmistakable crack of glass shattering. Shouts, footsteps, gunfire. It happened all at once. She turned from the window as the door burst open. A guard one she didn't recognize rushed inside. His chest was heaving, his shirt bloodied. He motioned for her to move, but she didn't need direction. She ran. The corridor she had walked, in silence now echoed with chaos. The walls trembled. Voices shouted in Italian commands, warnings, prayers. The scent of smoke curled through the air, acrid and hot. She did not cry, did not scream. She moved like a woman who knew this was always a possibility, like someone who had already accepted that love built in shadow must answer for the light it defied. She reached the staircase as another explosion shook the ground. The lights flickered. A scream cut the air, followed by the snap of gunfire. So close it felt like thunder. And then his voice, not shouting, not calling her name, but barking orders, contained, commanding, alive. She turned toward it instinctively, but hands caught her shoulders. A guard pulled her back toward the hidden passage near the east wing, the one Luca had shown her with only a glance, a subtle gesture weeks ago, a precaution she hadn't thought would matter. Now it was the only thing that did. She descended the narrow stone steps into darkness. The passage was silent, but for her breathing, she could still hear the sounds above: gunfire, boots, fury. Somewhere, men were dying. For him, for her. At the bottom of the steps, another door waited. Beyond it, a tunnel. And beyond that escape. She stopped. She could leave, run, disappear, be free. But freedom without him tasted like ash. She turned back. When she reached the upper floor again, the air was choked with smoke. A fire had started in the west wing. Shadows danced wildly on the walls. The walls themselves groaned with heat. She ran toward the sound of battle. Toward him. She found him in the main hall. His shirt was torn at the shoulder, blood smeared down his arm, a weapon in each hand. His men were fighting around him. Bodies lay on the floor, some still, some screaming. The air reeked of metal and fury. And then he saw her. The moment froze. His eyes widened not in fear, but in disbelief, as if she was something that could not possibly be real in a world this cruel. Then he moved. He crossed the chaos in seconds, grabbing her wrist, pulling her behind him as another round of gunfire tore through the wall behind them. He didn't speak, but his hand never let go. They moved through the estate like ghosts fleeing a dying world. Each room burned hotter. The mansion that had once held centuries of secrets now collapsed in smoke and fire. Paintings blistered, marble cracked. Everything elegant turned savage. In the inner garden, the last group of his men formed a wall, holding the perimeter. They bought him time. He didn't waste it. He dragged her to the black car, parked half-crushed under a falling column. The windshield was shattered, the driver dead. He shoved open the rear door and pushed her inside, but she resisted. Her hands gripped his arms. She looked up at him, covered in ash and blood and dust, and in his eyes she saw it. The breaking, not of his control, of his silence. He had brought ruin upon himself the moment he let her in, and he knew it. He stepped into the car beside her. Just as the remaining men began their retreat, the engine roared. The tires screamed. They drove through fire, out of the gates, through the hills, past the trees. The estate vanished in the mirror behind them, swallowed in black smoke and orange flame. Neither of them spoke. Her hand reached across the seat, searching. He took it, held it, bled into it. They didn't stop until they reached the second house one she had never seen, hidden deep in the northern hills. Smaller, simpler, safer. He collapsed onto the floor when the doors shut behind them. The doctor arrived an hour later. He had been shot, twice. The bullets had passed through, clean but deep. She stayed beside him the entire time. She didn't cry. Not until she washed the blood from his hands. Not until she folded his torn shirt and smelled the smoke still caught in the fibers. Not until she realized what it meant to belong to a man whose life burned so brightly it scorched everything he loved. But she didn't leave. Not that night. Not the next. He woke 3 days later, eyes opening slowly, unfocused, then sharp. And when he saw her sleeping in the chair beside the bed, her hand still wrapped around his, he didn't speak, but he didn't let go. Weeks passed. The world beyond their new shelter moved slowly. Enemies hunted ghosts. Rumors spiraled. The Moretti name, once whispered with awe, was now feared with uncertainty. But inside that quiet house, something else grew. Not safety, not peace, but permanence. They became each other's gravity. No longer predator and prey. Not master and captive, but man and woman. Scar and scar. Fire and ash. She helped him dress each morning. He watched her read beside the window. Eyes soft. She kissed the band. He touched her cheek with a hand no longer shaking, and neither said a word. Because some vows live best in silence, and some love is not spoken. It is survived.